When the first Burnout title came out in 2001, it resembled a Sega arcade racer and not much else. But with cars appearing though as they weigh half as much after impact, the fact there are impacts in the first place, the blueprints of what we're familiar with were there right from the very first title. With Burnout 2 Point of Impact, they improved the controls and turned the destruction dial up a notch, and the critical reception followed suit. But everything culminated with Burnout 3 Takedown. Despite wanting nothing to do with each other after the cancelled Skate or Die reboot fiasco, Electronic Arts took over publishing duties after Acclaim went bust. And inspired by SSX and fueled by motivation to prove the series was no fluke, Criterion created what is simply one of the greatest video games ever made. The takedown mechanic completely transformed the experience, the crash mode was more interactive, graphics were smooth, it was near flawless. And the extreme critical and commercial success came as such a surprise to Criterion, it took them a couple of months for it to sink in. By that point, they were already working on another follow-up, this time with much higher expectations. Firstly, they wanted to know exactly what players loved about Burnout 3 Takedown. They asked players for their feedback and interviewed some of the critics who gave it near perfect scores. And what they took away from it all is, to put it in simple terms, this follow-up needed an even more vulgar display of power. They experimented with lots of new ideas throughout development and studied Hollywood movies like Bad Boys 2. This led to new features including traffic checking and altered track designs to fit better with everybody's favorite event types. It was already sort of there in Burnout 3 Takedown with aggression meters on opponents based on the color of the position marker. But in Revenge they were put on a larger display, and throughout the playthrough you were always feeling vengeful. However, interestingly, director Alex Ward, reflecting over the game's development, didn't enjoy the process as much. Criterion planned to call the follow-up Burnout 4 Rush Hour, but were pressured by EA and a quote, posturing American idiot claiming 4 or 5 in the title kills success, which you can see clearly is completely untrue. But anyway, they said things like, get your revenge on Rush Hour, before finally going with Revenge, and that felt like nothing more than a branding decision. The mid-2000s were also a transitional period for video gaming, where multiple different systems were released, including the Nintendo DS, PlayStation Portable, and Xbox 360. And because EA wanted as many games for these consoles while they were new, while also working on first-person shooter Black at the same time, in fact these two would be released only a few weeks in between, it's there you understand why development might have been more frustrating. They had their work cut out for them. Burnout Revenge was officially announced by EA on April 2005 and was showcased along with Criterion's other titles at that year's E3. First impressions were that it has a good chance of being an improvement over the predecessor. It was released for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox in September, and the Xbox 360 version on March 2006. Speaking of that period in time, if you saw my review of the first Burnout, I mentioned that I went to an Xbox 360 showcase in Melbourne on February 2006, a month before the console came out in Australia. Memory is a little vague, but one of the few things that really stood out was the trailer of Burnout Revenge appearing all the time. Maybe I kept pressing it thinking maybe there was a playable demo, but there wasn't. It's also the first EA game not to have the early 2000s EA Games branding on the bottom of the cover. A little trivial, but I think that's another reason why I remember Burnout Revenge so well back when it came out, despite the fact that what you're seeing here is my first ever playthrough. Special thanks to Honza135 who requested it on Patreon and got the most likes. On top of almost everybody watching this video, probably. It was a matter of time. I mean, it's literally been a year since I've reviewed another Burnout game.
Burnout has now entered the era of high definition. So buckle up, ready for revenge.
As you can see, we're primarily looking at the Xbox 360 version for this review, because HD is always better, right? It was certainly the case when I reviewed Need for Speed Most Wanted back in 2018. Or is it? Gameplay and content wise, they're identical to the point where if you have a copy of Burnout Revenge for the PlayStation 2 or original Xbox, there's no point getting the 360 version, unless the crash mode is your favourite part since there are 10 additional junctions. But a lot of you would have noticed this before even watching this review. The 360 version has way too much glow and motion blur, which is why a lot of people actually prefer the PS2 and Xbox versions. Alex Ward claimed that with the previous titles in the series, because their dedicated aim with each one of them was to maintain 60 frames per second without any slowdown, it always came at the expense of other graphical features, including lighting. The final results were clearly very successful, but once they got their hands on next generation hardware, suddenly they had the technical power to utilize what they couldn't before, and they clearly got carried away. They also wanted their own look, not just to stand out as a unique franchise, but for every title. So when you look at screenshots of the game, Burnout Revenge instantly comes to mind. In fairness, it worked when I remember that 2005 trailer. It reminds me of Batman Begins Gotham City, and in the mid-2000s it was the style at the time. I'm sure it would have been mind-blowing back then seeing what the 6th gen titles couldn't do, but today it's muddy to the point where it's too distracting. I was worried it would look this way the entire playthrough, but as you unlock new locations, the colours depend on the level you're racing on, representing the surface or outside temperature. It actually looks very nice on tracks set at night like Eastern Bay, almost like a Ridge Racer playing at twice the gameplay speed. I think with all that said, don't forget that this is over 15 years old at the time of this review, and it's still a visual marvel to save ya. Compared to the 6th gen titles, the car damage model is a lot more detailed, the camera really shakes about when running over objects while still maintaining 60 frames per second. It all helps in elevating that sense of speed. And after you finish an event, exclusive to the 360 is a replay system, something I would have loved to have in the predecessor. Back then you were able to share 30 seconds on Xbox Live, but I think my YouTube channel where I'm reviewing the game, showing all the best highlights in one video where thousands are watching, is the better option for me. Personally. And of course, another great licensed soundtrack that's similar to the predecessor with a couple of remix tracks, but primarily alternative rock. And despite the first playthrough, it's a little nostalgic too, since I've heard some of these songs from other games as well. And it hurts my soul a little bit that I have to turn it off for this review, because it fits perfectly with all this carnage. Although there's no Crash FM, which some had mixed feelings about anyway, like DJ Striker interrupted way too often. It's also good to hear the Burnout 2 menu music as well. On first impression, the World Tour in Burnout Revenge is very similar to its predecessor, albeit easier to set up and navigate. It has all but one of the game modes and driving mechanics, so I'll only summarize what was taken from that game. Instead of relying on medals to advance through the World Tour, it uses a star setup where what you do on the road, whether it's takedowns, near misses, drifting, all that jazz, increases the star ranking here. The more you do and the less you screw up, the more stars you earn in a race, and earning gold gives you a bonus one, and that is what increases your ranking. There are also trophies to collect like the predecessor, but I never paid attention to it. What matters most to me is seeing 5 stars on every event possible. Despite being faster to reach the top level compared to the predecessor, the number of total events is similar with 169, and part of it has to do with the shorter and sharper setup of the events. For example, all races are only a few minutes long. The omitted event type is face-off, which was my least favorite in the predecessor, and with Eliminator it goes for a time-based format similar to Project Gotham Racing 3, where cars are eliminated every half minute. As mentioned at the start of the review, a lot of these changes have to do with the revenge gimmick. Now, the developers aimed for an even more aggressive approach, not that Burnout 3 Takedown wasn't aggressive enough. It has an even higher emphasis on fighting over racing, and you notice that on just the first event. This is a new one for the game, Traffic Attack, where the goal is to hit as many cars on the road as possible to keep the time extended. 5 minutes in, I already owe the Sunshine Keys area hundreds of millions of dollars in public damages, and that is what Burnout is about. I was worried this event would be too easy because I actually stopped out of boredom after reaching a perfect rating by a huge margin. But then after the next Traffic Attack, there was less to hit, roads are never straight, it has the difficulty curve set to a T. But once you get the multiplier, you're in business. I think it's until you've obtained the goal do you feel like you have nothing to lose and ultimately perform better, and end up with a much higher score than necessary. Good for the trophies, I suppose. Since traffic checking is a feature that also carries into the entire game, some say it removes that sense of danger compared to the predecessors, because being on the correct side almost guarantees you're not going to crash at all. But I see it as another progression of the gameplay in the Burnout series, like the crash mode in Point of Impact or takedowns in Takedown. And what it lacks in danger, it makes up for it in cinematic brute force. It's also easy to mistake buses and trucks since hitting them from behind still cause you to crash. In the 360 version, the extra graphical features make it harder to see what's ahead. You still get rewarded with extra boosts for near misses, and the track designs have been amped up with more obstacles like pillars, sharp edges, and cliff drops that can put you to a complete stop, so you can't just use the barriers for safety. When you're in the city centers, they're an eye-opener. Like the rest of the series, Criterion's criteria for choosing a location is that it has, quote, strong visual character and plenty of opportunities for gameplay. Then they would send the developers to those locations for extra research. Given they were also working on Black at the time, I'm surprised there isn't a location based on Russia here. At this point, every track in the whole series was one way, and the closest thing to shortcuts were highway exits. Now they're everywhere along with jumps and cutoffs. They appear more like expansions from the predecessor, which opens things up, and nearly every inch of tarmac is an almost guaranteed signature takedown. It's not perfect. Some events have too much traffic on screen at once, which affects the frame rate, and sometimes when you take down an opponent, your car becomes tangled to the point where you come to a complete stop without necessarily crashing. And even though the developers claim these track designs make taking down opponents easier, as you can see from the footage, I'm not so sure about that. Now, the general driving mechanics are identical to Burnout 3 Takedown. The way they slide and the boost meter through dangerous means increases it and vice versa if you crash. I feel like they perfected the driving mechanics with the predecessor, so I'm very glad they didn't change anything for the sake of it. Nothing to criticize here. The only difference is there'll be moments in events where if an opponent takes you out, it'll be marked as a revenge target. That's about it. If you get revenge, it's no better than a standard takedown. It would have made sense to add an extra reward for these, like twice the boost multiplier for example, rather than just self-satisfaction. I didn't feel any sense of vengeance throughout the World Tour since my natural instinct when playing a Burnout game is to smash as many vehicles as possible anyway. Also, I don't know if it's been a long time since I played a Burnout game or the way this one is programmed, but I found it surprisingly difficult to take down opponents this time round. They seem to be more stubborn, like they don't lose control when you shunt them, you can't psych them out into a mistake. I feel like this is why the roads are more focused on signature takedowns. They seem like the only way to actually take opponents down. I went back to the predecessor to make sure it wasn't just me simply being impatient, but right from the first road rage I got a gold medal easily. Even Burnout Paradise felt easier. And because every restart was also 15 seconds long, probably the worst thing about this game, it was a little more frustrating than I was expecting. It's crazy how much that can affect the entire experience. Not completely, but noticeably. At least for the first couple of hours of gameplay. The only event that gave me hope from that point was the crash mode. Firstly, I like how they doubled down on the puns now the references are more obvious, and was reportedly a good way to keep the developers amused while making the game. Instead of money tokens, multipliers and crash breaker spots scattered accordingly, the crash mode is meant to resemble more closely to golf rather than bowling, where most of them are set on unique districts purpose designed for this mode, where you smash into one set of traffic and causing enough carnage to fill the boost meter to crash break into another set where the closest thing to a token is a rival car somewhere hidden within the moving traffic. I mean, you sort of do that in the predecessor, but it's a lot easier to move around given how much lighter the car feels in Aftertouch mode. Instead of thinking about which tokens to collect, you need to think which lanes to clog up, taking advantage of the ability to ram traffic from behind and maintain the same level of strategy in a different way. Going back to the replay system, it's there where you can truly appreciate how destructive that attempt was. What's interesting about that crowd in the background is the sound team initially used recordings from multiple North American sporting events, but it sounded too generic for their liking. So in audio designer Lewis Griffin's words, right, well if that doesn't work, let's put in our own crowd. They brought in 30 to 40 developers in a tiny room, making noises so loud their faces were red towards the end of it. And with the 360 version, they wanted a quote US flavor for their cheers, so they got in touch with EA Studio Redwood Shores to do the same thing in their tiny room. This is a perfect example of Criterion's attention to detail when they're specific on background cheers in one of the many events in this game. As for the crash mode itself, Burnout 3 Takedown's version is better, but at least you get to destroy a lot more in one go. It's still crazy fun. Though I wish you could control the camera while in Aftertouch so you can see where the best place to crash break yourself to, or at least cut to where the action is if you can't move. But on the plus side, it adds to the pressure of reaching the gold medal at the final moment, even if the time limits could have been a few seconds longer. But the best part of Burnout Revenge is adding the Crash Breaker feature to all the other events. It might not sound like much, but for some reason this is another perfect stress reliever to any criticisms with the whole game. Maybe this is where the revenge gimmick comes into its own, because this is the closest thing you'll get to a proper sense of revenge, even if the crash in question is 100% your own fault. Whatever, it's the opponent's fault. Take that! With these events, after getting taken down or crashing, if there's boost left in your tank, you have an opportunity to crash break and create a larger radius to take down opponents even as a wreck. That was 4 opponents I just took down with one crash breaker, and I thought it couldn't be more chaotic. Even in defeat, you remain victorious. In fact, I owe plenty of victories to this mechanic. It's easy to forget how aware opponents are on the road. They're very good at avoiding accidents. But with this, you're almost guaranteed a chance to make amends every time you crash. It keeps the action even more consistent throughout the playthrough, and it should have been implemented in all the events. By the time I reached the ranking of insane, when all opponent-based events had crash breakers and takedowns became a lot easier to pull off, that's when I started to love Burnout Revenge as much as the predecessor. The footage speaks for itself. That said though, you can almost tell from the way I was talking about Burnout Revenge. The big difference with reviewing both these games, after playing Burnout 3 Takedown, it was a massive jump from point of impact. I've become highly accustomed to this level of chaos. There's not as much of a wow factor going into Burnout Revenge. It's a hard thing for developers when they climb the top of the scrapyard mountain, but then they have to know how to surprise the audience again. Sometimes, as long as you have as much of what everyone loved about the predecessor, it's almost a guaranteed winner. And with its traffic check, crash mode and track designs, it's different enough to be a proper sequel without taking away what made it good in the first place, and another extension of the franchise's gameplay evolution. Apart from takedowns being harder, but once crash breakers were introduced to the other events, it felt like order was restored. And by that I mean order had been completely lost on these roads. Though keep in mind, I've been comparing Burnout Revenge to arguably the greatest arcade racer I ever made. I feel like that alone is a huge compliment. I say don't think about how it compares to its predecessor and just enjoy Burnout Revenge for what it is. Another fast, loud, crazy, spectacular, yet well-controlled arcade racer. Another absolute recommendation, no matter what version you've got, PS2, original Xbox 360, you're gonna get the best of what it has to offer. But if I had to pick one, I would recommend the 360 version, because despite Criterion saying there were no plans to make it backwards compatible with the Xbox One back in 2015, 3 years later they changed their minds, so if you have an Xbox One or Series X, you have that flexibility. Shame it didn't get the remastered treatment like Burnout Paradise, but I can't say it deserved it more until I arrive in Paradise City, which I definitely will in the future.